Hi everyone, my name is Sragvi Basireddy, and I'm a sophomore from Hillsborough High School. Today, I'll be presenting my systematic review examining the correlation between vitamin D deficiency and osteoporotic fracture incidence in adults aged 50 and older. Let me start with the scope of this problem. Osteoporosis affects over 53 million Americans and was responsible for more than 2 million fractures in 2005 alone, with healthcare costs exceeding $19 billion. With our aging population, there's been a projected 50% increase in both fracture incidence and costs over recent decades. Beyond the financial burden, osteoporotic fractures led to a cumulative loss of 5.8 million disability adjusted life years in 2000. That represents significant morbidity, mortality, and reduced quality of life for millions of people. But where does vitamin D fit into this picture? Vitamin D plays a critical role in bone health by facilitating calcium absorption in the intestine and aiding in bone mineralization. When someone is vitamin D deficient, defined as serum 25 hydroxyvitamin D levels below 20 nanograms per milliliter, a cascade of problems begins. Deficiency leads to decreased calcium absorption, triggering secondary hyperparathyroidism, increased bone resorption, and ultimately elevated fracture risk. This is especially problematic in older adults who face reduced skin synthesis capacity, limited sun exposure, dietary insufficiency, and age related changes in vitamin D metabolism. Here's the challenge though. While the biological mechanism is clear, the clinical evidence has been surprisingly inconsistent. Some studies show strong associations between low vitamin D and fractures, while others find weak or non significant relationships. Some randomized trials show benefits from supplementation, but others show minimal effects, even when paired with calcium. This heterogeneity in the literature is what motivated this comprehensive systematic review. My objective was to examine the association between vitamin D deficiency and osteoporotic fracture risk in adults aged 50 and older, and to assess the consistency of this relationship across different populations, fracture sites, and study designs. I followed PRISMA guidelines for this review. I conducted comprehensive searches across PubMed and Medline, Google Scholar, and Cochrane databases, using terms related to vitamin D status, osteoporosis, and fracture outcomes. My inclusion criteria focused on observational studies or randomized control trials, measuring serum 25 hydroxyvitamin D levels and osteoporotic fracture incidence in adults 50 and older. I excluded pediatric populations, high energy trauma cases, and studies older than 25 years. For quality assessment, I used the Newcastle Ottawa scale, classifying studies as high quality with 7 or more points, moderate quality with 4 to 6 points, or low quality with 3 or fewer points. My initial search yielded 2,049 potentially relevant articles. After removing 707 duplicates, I screened 1,646 articles by title and abstract. 115 articles underwent full text review, and ultimately, 11 studies met my final inclusion criteria. Here is my Prisma flow diagram if you'd like to gain another perspective on this matter. These 11 studies comprised 6 prospective cohort studies, 3 case control studies, 1 randomized control trial, and 1 cross sectional study conducted across Europe and Asia. Quality assessment revealed that 60% of the observational studies were high quality, 40% were moderate quality, and importantly, no studies were classified as low quality. This gives us confidence in the reliability of these findings. First, before we proceed, I'm just going to very briefly show you guys a diagram of a summary of all 11 findings that were discovered from these initial studies. If you are ever confused, please refer back to this slide as it's likely got all the info that you'll need. That being said, what did I find? 9 of the 11 studies, that's 82%, demonstrated statistically significant associations between vitamin D deficiency and increased osteoporotic fracture risk. Effect estimates range from hazard ratios of 1.7 to 3.1, with most studies reporting moderate to strong association. The strongest association came from the Dutch LASDA cohort, which found a 3.1 fold increased fracture risk for severe deficiency, vitamin D levels at or below 12 nanograms per milliliter in adults aged 65 to 75 years. Looking specifically at hip fractures, the evidence becomes even more compelling. 8 studies examined hip fracture risk, and 7 of them, 88%, reported significant positive associations. The Danish intervention study showed a 16% overall fracture reduction with calcium and vitamin D supplementation. The Swedish cohort was particularly striking. Women with continuously low vitamin D levels had a 27.9% hip fracture incidence over 10 years, compared to just 12.3% in those with adequate levels, a hazard ratio of 2.7. Cross sectional studies from Japan and India revealed extremely high prevalence of vitamin D deficiency in hip fracture patients, 71.7% and 74.2% respectively. For vertebral fractures, I saw moderate evidence. Three of four studies, 75%, demonstrated significant associations, though with notable geographic variation. The Chinese case control study found a 28% risk reduction per standard deviation increase in vitamin D levels. Six studies examined various other osteoporotic fractures, including wrist, forearm, and pelvic fractures, showing consistent association across these fracture types. Now, here's one of the most interesting findings. The Dutch LASA study revealed that vitamin D deficiency significantly predicted fractures in adults aged 65 to 75 years, with that hazard ratio of 3.1, but showed no significant association in those 75 and older. What does this mean? This age dependent effect challenges the assumption that vitamin D benefits increase linearly with age. Instead, there appears to be an optimal window for intervention earlier in the aging process before competing risk factors become dominant. This has profound implications. Are we focusing our screening and supplementation of efforts on the right age groups? The data suggests that we might achieve the maximum benefit by targeting people in their late 60s and earlier 70s rather than the oldest populations. I also observed substantial geographic differences. Asian populations consistently showed much higher rates of deficiency compared to European populations. Japanese hip fracture patients averaged just 16.5 nanograms per milliliter. Indian patients averaged 9.9 nanograms per milliliter, while European populations generally had higher baseline levels. Interestingly, the French Ophélie study found no significant association between vitamin D and fracture risk in a relatively healthy postmenopausal population with fewer severe deficiencies. This suggests the relationship may be strongest in populations with more prevalent and severe deficiency. Another interesting pattern emerged, varying optimal vitamin D thresholds across different populations. The Dutch study identified 12 nanograms per milliliter as critical. The Chinese study showed protective effects at 20 nanograms per milliliter or above. And the Japanese study suggested benefits at 28.4 nanograms per milliliter or higher. This population specific variation is important for developing targeted clinical guidelines. So, what do these findings mean for clinical practice? They support vitamin D screening and supplementation programs in high risk populations, particularly adults in their mid 60s and mid 70s. The dose response relationship suggests that preventing vitamin D deficiency could be a viable public health intervention, given that the particularly strong association with the hip fractures, which carry the highest morbidity or mortality among osteoporotic fractures. This becomes especially important. The age stratified findings suggest that we need age specific prevention strategies rather than a one size fits all approach. Vitamin D status should be considered as one component of a comprehensive fracture risk assessment. Of course, this review had several limitations I need to acknowledge. Most of the included studies were observational, which prevents definitive causal inferences. Confounding by unmeasured factors like BMI and chronic diseases can't be completely excluded. There was variation in vitamin D measurements methods across studies, though all used standardized assays. Fracture ascertainment methods also varied. Some studies relied on self report, while others used medical records or radiographic confirmation. The review was limited to English language publications, which may introduce publication bias. The French study's negative findings in a healthier population suggest publication bias towards positive findings may have inflated effect estimates in higher risk populations. Looking ahead, more recent large scale randomized controlled trials or RCT trials are needed to establish causality, as most existing RCTs are over 25 years old. Studies in more diverse ethnic populations and age groups would enhance generalizability. Investigation of optimal vitamin D thresholds for fracture preventions warrants further exploration, and research into the cost effectiveness of population based screening and supplementation programs would help inform public health policy decisions. To wrap this up, This systematic review provides robust evidence supporting a significant association between vitamin D deficiency and increased osteoporotic fracture risk in adults age 50 and older. The key takeaways are significant associations in 9 of 11 studies with effect estimates from 1.7 to 3.1, strongest effects in adults aged 65 to 75 with diminishing associations on older populations, substantial geographic variation with higher deficiency rates in Asian populations, and population specific optimal thresholds ranging from 12 to 20.4 nanograms per milliliter. Given the substantial public health burden of osteoporotic fractures and the modifiable nature of vitamin D deficiency, addressing this risk factor through both clinical and population based interventions is crucial. Here are my works cited pages, including all the sources I have utilized during this presentation. I'd like to thank the International Young Researchers Conference for providing me with an opportunity to showcase my work, the Medicine and Research Science Program for guiding me through my research, Nora Tupsh for acting as my mentor during this project, and the audience for listening. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions through my email or LinkedIn presented here. Thank you guys.